Ever felt like a stranger at your own kitchen table?
They came back from Paris with matching t-shirts, a fridge magnet shaped like the Eiffel Tower, and a suitcase full of flaky croissants that had been crushed during the flight. What they didn't bring home, though, was their daughter, and, depending on how good their memory was, they might have also noticed that the joint account they used to pay the mortgage, the one they'd handed over to me out of convenience about 5 years ago, had a gaping hole the size of $75,000. Not stolen. Not embezzled. Just redistributed. Fairness, you could say. Retrospective child support. I guess the story really begins the day they sat across from me at the kitchen table, beige chairs, coffee rings on the surface, same ugly fruit bowl that had been there since 2002, and said those 8 words that I would never forget. We only had budget for 1 child this year. Just like that. No apology. No hesitation. It was the same tone my mom used when she was returning expired yogurt or asking the waiter for a new fork. Casual. Final. They said it as if I wasn't 30 years old and paying off my own student loans with a corporate job that had me up at 6, still dressed in Excel sheets by midnight. They said it like I was still a teenager sulking about not getting the front seat. Ryan, my younger brother by 6 years and somehow always treated like the eldest, grinned like an idiot while stuffing his 3rd slice of pizza into his mouth, completely unbothered by the silence in the room that followed. They were taking him to Paris for spring break. A little family getaway, Mom called it. He's had such a tough semester, she added, while I sat there with a stress rash crawling up my arms and not even the strength to ask, "And what the hell do you think I've had?" There was no fight. No argument. I just nodded, told them that sounded nice, and excused myself to finish up work, which was a lie. All I did was sit in my room, staring at the ceiling, letting the hum of the house settle into me like poison. I didn't cry. Crying felt useless. It felt too close to begging, and I had stopped begging them to see me about 10 years ago. But I did open my laptop. And I did pull up the online banking system. It was something I never thought I'd actually do. Not because I didn't think they deserved it, but because for the longest time I thought that maybe, just maybe, they'd come around on their own. Maybe if I was helpful enough, responsible enough, quiet enough, they'd stop seeing me as a bonus adult, living under their roof and more like their daughter. But people don't change for who you are. They only change for what they lose. My name had been on their joint account since Dad retired and couldn't figure out how to navigate online banking. At the time, I was 25, living at home temporarily, trying to claw my way out of the gig economy. They said it made sense. You're good with numbers. You're detail-oriented. You're the reliable one. The words felt like compliments back then. Now I hear them for what they were: labels. Chains. The responsible child isn't loved more. She's just useful longer. I waited until the night before their flight. They were in their room, packing what sounded like half the mall into 2 large suitcases, arguing over adapters and walking shoes. I sat at the desk with my name still engraved on the family desktop, Jenna's workstation, and typed without hesitation. I didn't drain the account. That would have been cruel. But I took enough. Enough to make them panic. Enough to make them call the bank and sit in a long, humiliating queue. Enough for them to realize that maybe, just maybe, they shouldn't have entrusted their finances to the invisible daughter they didn't think twice about cutting out of the family trip. And yes, I left a note. Not on paper. That's too sentimental, too easy to throw away. I left it on the whiteboard in my bedroom, the one Mom always mocked me for keeping because, what are you, a teacher? I wrote 1 sentence. You raised 1 child, now live with him. I didn't slam the door when I left. I didn't even take the good luggage. Just a small carry-on and the essentials. My lease had been signed the month before, a quiet little apartment about 2 hours away that I'd never told them about. I'd kept it just in case. In case I finally got tired of being the unpaid therapist, the built-in babysitter, the disappointment who somehow still managed the bills. I left the thermostat on 70, just to make sure the place stayed warm. I didn't want the plants to die. Or maybe that's just what I told myself to feel like I wasn't being cruel. Maybe I still needed to believe I had some thread of empathy left in me for the people who had looked me in the eye and said, with complete, brutal honesty, that their love had a price tag. I didn't hear from them the first few days. They posted a photo from the airport, then another from the Eiffel Tower. Matching scarves. Ryan pretending to smoke a baguette like a cigar. My mom captioned it, "Family time is the best time." I almost laughed. But I knew what was waiting for them back home. A half-empty house. An empty room. A blank whiteboard with a single, bitter sentence. And a checking account that now read like a lesson in consequences. Some people think revenge is loud, screaming matches, broken dishes, doors torn off their hinges. But the most effective revenge is silent. Surgical. Because it's not about making them feel what you felt. It's about making them finally notice that you felt anything at all. And they were about to notice. There's a certain kind of silence that follows you out of childhood like a shadow you can't shake, a silence not born from the absence of noise, but from the constant, suffocating presence of being unseen. And growing up in that house, under that roof with those people, meant learning how to interpret that silence like a second language, one where praise was reserved for the child who stumbled, failed, and needed rescuing, while competence and self-sufficiency were met not with respect, but with indifference so sharp it might as well have been contempt. My brother Ryan, 6 years my junior and somehow always orbiting the center of the family like the golden child that never had to earn the title, had this way of failing upwards that baffled anyone outside our four walls. He was the kid who forgot homework, got detention, dented the car, missed curfew, and still came home to applause because, in my parents' eyes, he was finding himself, a phrase that never once applied to me despite spending most of my 20s clawing my way out of debt and emotional invisibility with nothing but grit and a little luck. I remember one Christmas, I must have been around 19, when I spent 3 weeks working double shifts at the local diner just to afford something nice for everyone. A leather wallet for Dad, perfume for Mom, noise-canceling headphones for Ryan so he could focus better in college, even though we all knew he'd drop out by spring. Christmas morning came, and while they opened my gifts with polite smiles, offering those lukewarm thank yous that feel more like a social reflex than actual gratitude, Ryan handed my parents some crumpled coupons from a school fundraiser and was met with laughter, warmth, and that proud headshake from my father that said, "You're one of a kind, kid." I got socks. That was the year it really started sinking in. The truth that I wasn't just different, I was peripheral, like a well-oiled machine they were glad worked but never thought to appreciate. By 23, I had already taken on the unofficial role of household administrator, handling their tax forms, researching insurance options, scheduling medical appointments, and eventually, when Dad retired and his patience for anything digital ran thin, managing their joint finances. It started small, a login here, a password there, a few wire transfers, until one day I was tracking every expense, every direct deposit, every credit card statement, not because I wanted to, but because they expected me to. Not with thanks, but with casual assumption. "Jenna can handle that," Mom would say, flicking her hand like it was nothing, like the mental bandwidth it took to juggle my job, their needs, and my own slowly unraveling sanity was just part of what it meant to be the capable one. What they didn't know, or maybe they did know and just didn't care, was that this constant responsibility didn't make me feel trusted or valued. It made me feel trapped. There was no praise, no acknowledgement, no small gesture to say, "We see how hard you're working." Only the suffocating pressure of never being allowed to fall apart because, in their eyes, I never needed support, never needed a Paris trip, never needed anything at all except to be reliable. Even my career, a mid-level role at a financial consulting firm with long hours, mediocre pay, and barely enough flexibility to pretend I had a life, was treated like a cute hobby by my parents. When Ryan landed an unpaid internship at some marketing agency, they threw him a party. When I got promoted to team lead, they forgot to ask how the first day went. If I brought up work, their eyes glazed over. If Ryan mentioned a funny client or a bad meeting, they hung on every word like it was front-page news. And then there was the time I was rear-ended during a blizzard, skidding into a snowbank, waiting 45 minutes for a tow truck with my fingers going numb and my voice shaking while I called the house. Mom picked up, said, "Isn't that what AAA is for?" and hung up before asking if I was hurt. 2 weeks later, when Ryan's car battery died at the grocery store, they drove 30 miles in freezing rain to jump it and still talk about it like some heroic family legend. I suppose the truth is that they never had to say the words, "We love him more," out loud, because everything they did, and everything they didn't, said it for them in 100 tiny ways that added up to one massive void. A void that I tried to fill with obedience, excellence, and then, finally, silence, once I realized nothing I did would ever be enough to shift the balance. By the time I turned 30, the distance between us wasn't physical, though I was still living in the guest room they refused to stop calling your room, as if that word carried any warmth. No, the distance was emotional, psychological, the kind that forms when you finally stop trying to explain yourself to people who aren't listening and start planning your exit quietly, methodically, the way I'd always done everything. With precision. With patience. And maybe that's what scared them most. Not that I was angry or rebellious, but that I was calm. That when they told me they were taking Ryan to Paris, because there was only budget for one child, I didn't protest or cry or beg for inclusion. I just nodded, smiled faintly, and went upstairs to log into their bank account like I had 1,000 times before. But this time, instead of double-checking their bill payments or filing their receipts, I started a new folder. Inside it, I documented every transaction. I built a trail. I prepared. Not for theft. Not for revenge. But for justice, or whatever version of justice exists when you've been the background character in your own family for too long and finally decide that being forgotten isn't enough of a punishment for the people who trained you to believe invisibility was love. I remember recording a voice note to Tasha, my best friend since college, and saying, if they want to treat me like I don't matter, then maybe it's time I become someone they can't ignore. Her reply was cautious, the way people are when they know you're past the point of diplomacy, but still holding on to the idea that maybe, just maybe, reconciliation is possible. But I wasn't interested in reconciliation. I was interested in truth. In a reckoning. And it was coming. The night I transferred the money wasn't stormy or dramatic or dripping with symbolism the way people expect pivotal moments to be in stories like these. The sky didn't crack open, no power flickered, and the only sound in the room came from the soft clicking of my laptop keys and the faint hum of the ceiling fan that had been spinning above my bed for as long as I could remember, always too slow to cool the room in summer and too loud to ignore in winter. It was quiet, methodical, familiar. The way most betrayals unfold, not in explosions, but in the slow exhale of someone who's finally tired of waiting to be seen. I had rehearsed it in my mind for weeks, maybe months, though if I'm being honest, it probably started years before, the first time I opened the family bank account to pay a cable bill and realized that my name sat next to theirs not just as a convenience, but as a symbol of the unspoken agreement we'd lived by my entire adult life. I would manage the unglamorous details of their lives, and in return, they would ignore mine entirely. I had taken care of every auto payment, monitored every overdraft warning, flagged every suspicious charge, and even corrected my father's tax filings 3 years in a row after he insisted he didn't need a CPA, all while balancing my own bills, navigating a high-stress job, and watching from the sidelines as Ryan was praised for accomplishments I could have completed blindfolded with one hand behind my back and a migraine the size of Nebraska. It wasn't a spontaneous act of revenge. It wasn't rage. It was a slow, simmering realization that I had been handed every adult responsibility without any of the respect or care that should accompany it. They didn't trust me because they saw me as mature or capable. They trusted me because I was convenient, low maintenance, and, in their eyes, emotionally non-essential. And when someone starts treating you like a piece of furniture that also pays the bills, it's only a matter of time before you start thinking like an accountant instead of a daughter. I didn't take everything. I want that to be clear, even now, even with everything that's happened since. I didn't clear the account. I didn't ruin them. I left enough for the mortgage, the utilities, the buffer they'd need to keep up appearances. But I redirected a substantial amount, exactly $73,628, into a trust account I had quietly opened under my name 6 months earlier, during a weekend trip they didn't even ask about. It was an irrevocable trust, airtight, locked behind layers of legal protection, accessible only by me, and documented in a way that made it perfectly legal, because if there was one thing they'd taught me, it was how to follow rules in ways that hurt people anyway. The process itself was absurdly simple. Two-factor authentication, a few approval texts, a security code emailed to my personal account. They'd never bothered changing the recovery information. I'd been handling it all for so long, they barely remembered what their passwords were, let alone what kind of access they had granted me. And as I sat there, watching the progress bar inch forward on the transaction page, I didn't feel powerful or vengeful or even particularly satisfied. I felt a strange, hollow calm. The kind that creeps in when you finally accept that the version of family you grew up hoping for is never going to materialize, and the only thing left to do is sever the connection cleanly, like cauterizing a wound before the infection spreads. I closed the laptop with the same quiet precision I'd used to open it. My room was already packed, 2 suitcases in the corner, boxes taped and labeled, the walls stripped bare of the few photographs I had bothered to keep. There was no drama, no slam of the door, no midnight cab ride into the unknown. I simply loaded the car, locked the front door behind me, and drove to a small apartment 2 cities over that I had leased months in advance, not out of impulse, but out of necessity, a safety net, a contingency plan. A final insurance policy against a family that had never been interested in my survival, only in my usefulness. They were still in Paris. Still posting curated photos on social media of sidewalk cafes, overpriced pastries, and forced smiles in front of monuments they probably didn't care about. Ryan had tagged me in a group photo out of habit, a gesture that meant nothing, said nothing, and, in its own way, proved everything. I didn't react. I didn't respond. I let them enjoy the illusion a little longer, let them believe they were still the proud parents of 2 children, one present, one invisible. Both orbiting their carefully constructed narrative like props in a play that had run too long without anyone questioning the script. 3 days later, the calls started. First, it was a missed call from my mom around 3 in the morning, no message. Then another at 6. By noon, I had 15 missed calls, 2 voicemails, and a long, frantic text from my father that began with, "What the hell did you do?" and ended with the kind of tone he reserved for customer service agents and me when I stepped out of line. I didn't respond. I let them stew in it. Because for once, they weren't in control of the narrative. For once, they had to sit in the silence and wonder, not where I had gone, but why I had finally left. And for people who had never cared enough to ask that question before, I figured the wait would be good for them. I turned off my phone that evening, curled up on a borrowed couch in an apartment that smelled like fresh paint and new beginnings, and whispered the words I had been too afraid to say out loud for far too long. They don't get to be confused. They don't get to be hurt. They don't get to ask why I'm gone when they were never really there to begin with. And I meant it. Every word. It didn't happen all at once, which is probably what made it worse, the fallout, I mean, because if it had come crashing down like some cinematic explosion, all fire and screaming and broken glass, I think I could have handled it with more detachment. With that kind of dark satisfaction you're supposed to feel when people finally taste the consequences of years of selfishness. But instead, what I got was the slow, creeping unraveling of a story they refused to admit they were part of, a careful rewriting of events so rehearsed and insidious it made me question, if only briefly, whether I had imagined everything from the beginning. It started with silence, the kind that feels strategic, curated, like the way someone closes a door quietly not to keep the peace, but to let you know you're on the outside now. For about a week, maybe 10 days, there was nothing, no voicemails, no texts, not even a passive-aggressive email from my mother pretending to ask about my health while sneaking in jabs about poor choices or disappointments we don't speak of. Just total, calculated quiet. I could feel it from miles away, like the sound had been sucked out of a vacuum, and I knew exactly what they were doing, circling the wagons. Drafting a version of the story that absolved them completely while making me the villain in a tale they had conveniently edited to fit the only narrative they ever cared about, one where they were the loving, generous parents of a difficult, unstable daughter who had turned on them without reason. I found out what they had said through my cousin Melanie, a woman I barely spoke to outside of obligatory holiday texts and the occasional shared eye roll across Thanksgiving tables. She messaged me one night, her tone hesitant and full of those awkward social cues people use when they know they're stepping into someone else's disaster, and told me that my mother had called her in tears, real or fake, who could tell anymore, and said that I had snapped, that I was in crisis, that I had emptied their bank accounts during some kind of psychotic break and had run away without explanation. The words didn't surprise me as much as the ease with which they came, the swiftness with which my family, a network of cousins and second cousins and aunts who had seen my quiet competence for years, simply accepted the lie without so much as a phone call to verify my side of it. I didn't feel betrayed by them, not exactly. I hadn't expected support from the sidelines, but I did feel the sting of clarity, the realization that when your family decides you're the problem, they won't let facts get in the way of a good story. And no amount of past loyalty or sacrifice or reliability will save you from being painted as the hurricane when, in truth, you were just the flood barrier finally giving way. My father went further in ways I didn't anticipate. He called my job, left voicemails for my boss, claimed I had stolen from them, that I was mentally unstable, that I had manipulated them into giving me access to their finances under false pretenses. The audacity would have been laughable if it hadn't been so chilling, not because I was in danger of losing my job. I had already quit 2 weeks prior after accepting a remote position in a different city under a different name, but because it showed me just how far he was willing to go to protect his pride, how little he cared about whether I survived the fallout, as long as I didn't make him look like the kind of man who could lose control over his household, his money, or his daughter. I responded once, a single email sent to both of them, short, surgical, and impossible to misunderstand. It read, "You raised one child. Now live with him." I didn't attach explanations or justifications or apologies. I didn't offer a chance for reconciliation or a list of demands or even a final goodbye. I simply drew the line and stepped back, not to hurt them, but to remind myself that I was finally free from the sick cycle of hoping they would change. And then something else happened, something I hadn't expected, though in hindsight I should have seen it coming, because betrayal, like rot, doesn't always stop with the source, it spreads. Tasha, my closest friend, the one person I had trusted with everything, the sleepless nights, the stolen moments of doubt, the quiet confessions of guilt, did something I still don't have the words for. She gave them access to the trust. Not full access, not enough to reverse what had been done, but enough to hurt me, to unravel the privacy and protection I had spent months constructing. She claimed she didn't mean to, that it had been a slip, a screenshot sent in a moment of panic when my mother called her sobbing and desperate, playing the part of the heartbroken parent to perfection. But intent didn't matter, not then, not to me, because what she had done wasn't just a mistake, it was a fracture, a rupture in the only place I had allowed myself to believe was safe. I cut her off immediately, no screaming, no confrontation, just silence. The same silence my parents had weaponized for years, only this time, it was mine, and I wielded it not out of pettiness or rage, but because I finally understood the value of distance, the kind that protects, not punishes. Sitting alone in my new apartment, phone cleared of old contacts, social media wiped clean, the last trace of my old life reduced to boxes I hadn't unpacked yet, I didn't feel powerful or liberated or victorious. I felt quiet. I felt empty. But I also felt, for the first time in years, like I was no longer bleeding for people who would never stop cutting. And maybe that was enough. The months that followed were neither triumphant nor tragic, and if there was any real justice in the universe, perhaps they should have been one or the other, because what I lived through instead was that strange gray space that forms in the aftermath of a clean break. A space where clarity and guilt, freedom and isolation, truth and silence all rub against each other like mismatched bones that never quite healed properly, always aching just enough to remind you that something inside you had been fractured long before you ever found the courage to do anything about it. I settled into the rhythm of my new life with the kind of slow, cautious energy that only someone deeply wounded can understand, the kind that avoids bright lights and loud voices and sudden movement, not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. Because when you've spent years walking on emotional eggshells, even stillness can feel dangerous at first. My apartment, a two-bedroom walk-up in a part of town no one in my family had ever heard of, was quiet in the way a forgotten church is quiet, sacred, dusty, half-haunted by what used to be, and entirely mine. I filled it not with new furniture or bold declarations of independence, but with small, private rituals that allowed me to reclaim the parts of myself I had buried under decades of forced composure, coffee made just the way I liked it, playlists that never had to accommodate anyone else's taste, plants I watered not because someone guilted me into taking care of them, but because I wanted something to grow. I didn't reach out to anyone. I didn't post photos or cryptic quotes or self-congratulatory affirmations about healing and boundaries. I simply disappeared, not out of spite, but because after so many years of being scrutinized, minimized, and misunderstood, the most radical act I could perform was to stop offering explanations for my absence. I existed on my own terms, with my own rules, and if that made me a villain in someone else's narrative, I figured they were welcome to the story, just as long as they didn't expect me to play a part in it anymore. But silence, I learned, is not the same as closure, and even distance has a way of letting echoes through the cracks. I began to hear things not directly, never directly, but through the whisper chain that is always one cousin, one old coworker, one former friend too curious for their own good. I learned that Ryan had dropped out of graduate school 2 weeks after returning from Paris, that he'd moved back in with my parents, citing burnout and a need to reset, phrases that, for him, had always been socially acceptable excuses for simply refusing to grow up. I heard that the Paris trip had been a disaster, that he'd gotten food poisoning on the second day, and that the hotel had mixed up their reservation, leaving them in a double twin instead of the suite they'd bragged about for weeks beforehand. More importantly, I learned that the money I had taken, or more accurately, reclaimed, had caused a ripple effect they hadn't anticipated. Without the cushion of those savings, the mortgage payments began to feel heavier. The car lease became a point of stress. My father, now 3 years into retirement and barely managing his blood pressure, had started looking for part-time work again, while my mother, who had once boasted about her bridge group and Sunday brunches like they were royal duties, quietly stopped posting altogether. Their silence, which had once been weaponized against me, now read like defeat. And yet, there was no apology, no olive branch, no attempt to understand, to reflect, to take ownership of the choices that had led us here. What came instead was a letter, handwritten, of course, because my father still believed in the theater of ink and envelopes, that arrived one Tuesday morning with no return address, but a handwriting I would recognize even if I were blindfolded and bleeding. It was not a letter of reconciliation. It was not an acknowledgement of pain or a reaching out for peace. It was a demand, dressed in the hollow language of concern. He wanted to know where the money had gone, what I had done with it, and whether I understood the position I had placed them in. The letter was 5 pages long. I read only the first sentence. I burned it in the sink, slowly, deliberately, watching each word curl into smoke and vanish, not because I was angry, but because I refused to give their narrative another inch of space in my mind. They had written their version. I had written mine. And the difference was I no longer needed them to believe me for it to be true. There are people who will hear this story and say I went too far, that I should have confronted them, talked it through, tried harder to fix what was broken. There are people who will argue that family is sacred, that blood is thicker, that no betrayal justifies financial revenge or total estrangement. And to those people, I have nothing to say. Because unless you've spent your entire life being the backup plan in a family where love was conditional and visibility was currency, you cannot understand the quiet violence of being constantly overlooked. And you will never understand what it means to finally look in the mirror and say, no more. I did not destroy them. I did not bankrupt them. I did not ruin their lives. What I did was remove myself from a system that was built on my compliance, my silence, and my loyalty, and in doing so, I forced them to live with the version of themselves they had spent decades hiding from. I simply made the invisible cost visible. And maybe that's the truth about fairness that no one wants to admit, that sometimes the only way to balance the scales is not with justice or forgiveness or dialogue, but with absence. With the quiet, enduring power of walking away and letting them feel, finally, what it's like to live without the one person they never thought would leave. So if you're wondering whether I regret it, whether I miss them, whether I still think about the echo of my mother's voice or the way my father used to clear his throat before saying something he thought was wise, the answer is this: I don't regret the choice. But I do regret the years I spent waiting for them to choose me. And if you're asking whether I became the villain in this story, whether I turned cold or cruel or unrecognizable, I'll say only this. When you've been treated like a ghost your entire life, haunting them is the only way they'll ever remember you were real. Now you tell me, was it wrong, or was it finally fair?